Popovich is livid.
At the end of the third quarter,
he's got a great shooting touch.
Red Rocket for three.
Gregg Popovich is one of the greatest coaches in NBA history. He has 5 championships. He has more wins than almost any coach who ever lived. But NBA legends reveal how Gregg Popovich ruined them. So the question is simple. How many players paid a price for his system? This story does not start at the beginning. It starts near the end. Victor Wembanyama walked into San Antonio as one of the most exciting young players the league had seen in years. He was supposed to be the new face of the Spurs. But almost right away, fans and critics started asking strange questions. Why was Jeremy Sochan playing point guard? Why did Wembanyama keep missing games for reasons nobody could really explain? Why did the Spurs look so lost on the court, even with a generational talent standing right there? A generational talent like that usually arrives with hope, excitement, and a clear plan for the future. Instead, San Antonio looked confused. The lineups looked strange. The losses kept piling up. For a franchise that built its entire reputation on discipline and structure, that kind of disorder stood out immediately to anyone watching closely. Critics called it tanking. They said Popovich was throwing games on purpose to land a better draft pick, sacrificing wins in the present for a brighter future down the road. Other analysts watched the Spurs closely. Voices like Austin Rivers, Richard Jefferson, and Channing Frye pointed out something strange. They said teammates were almost ignoring Wembanyama on the floor, like he was not even part of the offense. Some people defended Popovich. They said he was simply protecting a young star's body for the long run, prioritizing health over a few extra wins in a season that was unlikely to end in a championship anyway. But others were not so sure. They wondered if this was something else. They wondered if this was the same old pattern playing out one more time. A coach who needed total control, no matter who got hurt by it. And if a story like this deserves more attention, use the hype feature and give this video hype. Because the deeper this goes, the more it becomes clear. Popovich's greatness came with a real cost. This is not the first time questions like these have followed Popovich. Long before Wembanyama, other names carried the same kind of doubt. Tony Parker, Beno Udrih, LaMarcus Aldridge, Richard Jefferson, Robert Horry, Dennis Rodman, Stephen Jackson, DeJounte Murray, Kawhi Leonard. Each one ran into the same wall in a different way, at a different point in Popovich's long career. To understand why a generational talent like Wembanyama could still end up surrounded by confusion, you have to go back almost 30 years. You have to go back to the man before he was a legend. Most fans know Gregg Popovich as a genius, a 5-time champion, the leader of something people just call the Spurs way. It sounds like a perfect story. A brilliant coach builds a perfect system, and the system wins forever. But the real story has a messier start. In December of 1996, Popovich was not even the coach. He was the general manager. The Spurs were off to a terrible 3-15 start, and a big part of that was a back injury to their superstar center, David Robinson. So Popovich made a bold move. He fired the head coach, a man named Bob Hill, and put himself on the bench instead. It happened fast, almost overnight, and it gave him a kind of power that very few general managers ever take for themselves. What happened next is where it gets uncomfortable. Robinson came back for only 6 games before breaking his foot completely. Other key players, including Sean Elliott and Chuck Person, missed most of that same season. The Spurs collapsed to a 20-62 record, one of the worst in the entire league. Some critics, including sports voices like Skip Bayless, have pointed out that this disaster actually helped Popovich. A terrible record meant a high draft pick. That high pick became Tim Duncan. Suddenly, Popovich had Duncan and a healthy Robinson together, a ready-made foundation for a championship team. His early struggles as a coach were covered up by pure luck, not by proven skill. And once Duncan was in San Antonio, almost nobody questioned Popovich's power again for nearly 30 years. This matters because it tells you something important about everything that came after. Popovich did not build his authority through years of being tested, failing, and slowly earning trust. He built it fast on the back of an injury crisis and a lucky draft pick, and once he had that authority locked in, he used it completely. He built something called the Spurs way. On paper, it sounds great. Players give up their ego, they give up personal stats, they play for the team, not for themselves. But underneath that nice description is something much harder. It was a system that tested players mentally, not just physically. And not every player passed that test in the same way. Think about what that early moment really set up: A young assistant general manager turned himself into a head coach almost overnight, with no long track record to prove he deserved that level of trust. Then a stroke of luck handed him the best player in the draft. From that point forward, very few people inside the organization were in a position to question his decisions, no matter how unusual they seemed. That kind of unchecked power can build something amazing. It can also let one man's vision go unchallenged for far too long, even when that vision starts to hurt the very people it depends on. Take Tony Parker. He arrived from France in 2001 as a 19-year-old kid. He barely spoke English well. He had no idea what he was really walking into. Popovich rode him hard from day one. Parker later wrote in his own book that the coaching bordered on abuse. He said he often left practice and cried in the shower because of how harshly Popovich criticized him in front of the entire team. Popovich wanted to strip away every habit Parker brought from European basketball. He wanted total compliance from a teenager who had just left his home country, and he pushed so hard that satisfying him felt almost impossible. No matter what Parker did on the floor, Parker survived it. He became a champion 4 times over and a Finals MVP. People love to point at that as proof the system works. But surviving something hard does not mean it was harmless. A young man does not forget being broken down in front of his teammates, night after night, even if he comes out stronger on the other side years later. The emotional scars from that rookie year stayed with Parker for the rest of his career, even as he smiled for championship photos and lifted trophies above his head. It is worth pausing on that detail for a moment. Parker was not a struggling fringe player trying to make a roster. He was a future Hall of Famer, a player with elite talent the moment he stepped off the plane from France. And even he describes those early years using a word as serious as abuse. If the system pushed that hard on a player who eventually became one of the greatest point guards of his generation, it raises an honest question about what that same pressure might have done to someone with a little less talent or a little less patience to survive it. Not every young player had Tony Parker's mental toughness. Beno Udrih is the clearest example of someone the system did not save. Drafted in 2004, Udrih came in as a promising backup point guard with real potential. But Popovich's constant pressure chipped away at his confidence instead of building it up. He was demoted further and further down the bench, eventually landing on the third-string unit. His minutes shrank. His self-belief shrank right along with them. Instead of adjusting his coaching to help the young guard adapt, Popovich pushed him aside completely. By October of 2007, Udrih was traded to Minnesota, where the Timberwolves waived him almost immediately afterward. One player walked through the fire and became a champion. Another player walked through that exact same fire and came out broken. That is not a coincidence. That is what happens when a system is built around one kind of player and quietly punishes everyone else who does not fit the mold. Udrih never got the chance that Parker got. Nobody wrote a documentary about his rookie struggles. Nobody asked him years later to reflect on his championship rings, because he never won one in San Antonio. His story simply faded into the background, a quiet example of how the same coaching style that built a Hall of Fame career for one player could just as easily end a promising one for another, with almost nobody outside the organization ever noticing the difference. Popovich also built his control into the way he picked players in the first place. He kept a highly selective approach to bringing new players onto the roster, often interviewing prospects about current events, books they had read, and their own family lives, long before he ever asked about their jump shot. He wanted players whose entire worldview reached beyond the basketball court. Players who could handle the kind of intense personal scrutiny that came with playing for him. In a strange way, this means some of the friction in this story was never an accident. Popovich was screening for compliance before a player even put on a Spurs jersey. It would be easy to say Popovich was simply cold and uncaring toward the people around him. But the full picture is more complicated than that, and that complication is part of what makes him so hard to judge. He personally sat down with a young Avery Johnson and reassured him of his own worth, even while cutting him from the roster to make room for David Robinson. When an assistant coach named Mike Brown was struggling through serious marriage problems, Popovich actually barred him from boarding the team plane, telling him to stay home and fix his family first, even threatening to fire him if he did not. So this was never a man without any empathy at all. He showed real care off the court in private moments nobody saw. But that same man also ran a locker room where the wrong fit, the wrong personality, or the wrong response in the wrong moment could end a career in San Antonio almost overnight. That contrast follows Popovich through almost every chapter of this story. He could be the coach who quietly protected a struggling assistant's marriage, and in the very same season, the coach who quietly ended a young player's career in San Antonio without much warning. Both versions of him are real. Neither one cancels the other out. That pattern becomes even clearer when you look at how Popovich handled established stars, not just young rookies trying to make a roster. LaMarcus Aldridge arrived in San Antonio in 2015 as a proven star. In Portland, he was a face-up scorer who lived in the mid-range, creating his own shots with footwork and skill, averaging more than 23 points a game. The Spurs signed him to be the next great Spurs big man after Tim Duncan, but Popovich did not adapt his system to fit Aldridge's natural strengths. Instead, he tried to turn Aldridge into something he was not. He wanted him to play like Jack Sikma, an old-school high-post hub, facing up from the elbow instead of attacking from the spots where he was most comfortable. Aldridge's scoring dropped sharply in his first 2 seasons with the team, falling to 18 points a game and then 17.5, well below the 23 points a game he had averaged back in Portland. He grew frustrated. He came close to requesting a trade out of San Antonio entirely. Here is what makes this story stand out from the others. Popovich actually admitted he was wrong. He later said that 95% of the blame fell on him because he tried to change Aldridge too much instead of building the offense around what already worked for him. That admission matters a great deal. It is proof, in Popovich's own words, that his need for control could actively damage a great player's game, not just his feelings or his mood. Richard Jefferson tells a similar story. Before joining the Spurs, he was a dynamic slasher, someone who thrived attacking the basket in transition, averaging close to 20 points a game with the New Jersey Nets and Milwaukee Bucks. In San Antonio, Popovich's rigid structure boxed him into a stationary, spot-up shooter role instead of letting him create. Jefferson's shooting percentage from three-point range crashed to barely 31% in his first year with the team, and his scoring average fell sharply along with it, dropping all the way down to just 11 points a game. His confidence crashed right along with the numbers. It eventually took a shooting coach working with him separately away from the main system to rebuild his shot and help him salvage the rest of his career. Robert Horry experienced this same wall when he arrived in 2003. He had spent years in Los Angeles playing in a flowing, read and react system under Phil Jackson. In San Antonio, the offense was tightly scripted, almost like a play diagrammed on a chalkboard. Horry later explained that if he saw an open backdoor cut and took it for an easy layup, his own teammates would look at him confused because he had broken away from the planned design of the play. He called it a military atmosphere, and it contributed to one of the worst statistical seasons of his career, a year where his scoring average fell to a career low of less than 5 points a game. 2 veteran stars, 2 completely different backgrounds, and the exact same problem waiting for both of them. Popovich's system often punished the very instincts that made great players great in the first place. 3 different stars, 3 different cities, 3 different playing styles. Aldridge, Jefferson, and Horry all arrived in San Antonio. Already proven, already successful, already trusted by other coaches to make their own decisions on the floor. And all 3 ran into the exact same wall. The system did not bend for them. They had to bend for the system or watch their own game slowly disappear in front of them. If a player adapted to the system, that system could turn him into a champion. But if a player pushed back or simply did not fit the mold Popovich had in mind, he was not afraid to remove that player completely. And nowhere is that clearer than the long history of players who clashed with him directly, year after year. Dennis Rodman might be the very first example of this pattern. Before Popovich was even the head coach, while he was still only the general manager, he clashed hard with Rodman's wild personality. Rodman gave him a nickname that says everything you need to know about how that relationship felt from the inside. He called him Mr. Military. Rodman believed Popovich was obsessed with turning him into a compliant, obedient soldier instead of letting him be himself on the floor. During the 1995 Western Conference Finals against Houston, Rodman refused to follow a defensive plan that called for him to double-team Hakeem Olajuwon because he believed the plan was simply flawed. Rodman also claimed Popovich had promised to take care of him in a new contract, saying the words directly to his face, then denied the entire conversation ever happened when reporters asked him about it later. After suspensions, a motorcycle accident, and Rodman reportedly sitting on the bench without even putting on his shoes during a game, Popovich decided he was done. He traded Rodman to the Chicago Bulls for a role player named Will Perdue, and he openly called the move addition by subtraction. Think about what that phrase really means. He was telling the entire league that removing one of the most talented rebounders in basketball history made his own team better, simply because that player would not bend to his control. Rodman went on to win 3 more championships in Chicago, playing a very different role under a very different coach. San Antonio, meanwhile, moved forward with a calmer, more obedient roster. Both paths worked out in terms of trophies. But the trade itself tells you exactly what Popovich valued most, even at the cost of one of the rarest defensive talents the sport has ever produced. Stephen Jackson learned a similar lesson almost 20 years later. He had already won a championship with the Spurs back in 2003. He returned to the team in 2012 and felt he had played well during their deep playoff run that same season. But his minutes started shrinking in favor of Danny Green and Manu Ginobili. According to Jackson, Popovich called a team meeting and demanded that Jackson stand up and admit, out loud, in front of the whole roster, that Green and Ginobili were simply better players than him. Jackson believed this was a setup, designed to provoke exactly the angry reaction his competitive ego would naturally produce. And it worked exactly as planned. Jackson reacted badly, and within days, Popovich released him just before the playoffs began, clearing a roster spot for Tracy McGrady instead. To be fair, some supporters argued Jackson was out of shape at the time, distracted by an outside rap album project and behaving in ways that disrupted the locker room. But Jackson himself has always maintained that being useful to the Spurs was never enough on its own. In Popovich's world, you also had to submit completely or you would be gone within days. Jackson later said he believed the Spurs would have won that 2013 championship if he had still been on the roster for the finals. That claim is impossible to prove either way, but it shows just how strongly he felt about what happened to him, and how personally he took being cut for refusing to play along with a confrontation he believed was staged from the start. DeJounte Murray proves this pattern did not end with the older generation of Spurs players. Drafted in 2016, Murray has said the Spurs organization played mind games with him, deliberately testing how far they could push him before he broke under the pressure. He claims the front office brought in international point guards, close to Manu Ginobili, specifically to play ahead of him on the roster. He has also said Popovich often favored Derek White over him, because White was more compliant and easier to manage day to day, while Murray refused to simply be what he called a yes man. To be fair, this pressure did push Murray to grow into a genuine all-star talent. The system worked, at least in a basketball sense, but it also left him with real distrust toward the organization. Distrust that eventually played a part in his trade to Atlanta a few years later. Growth and damage sitting side by side in the very same story. Exactly like so many other names in this list, Rodman, Jackson, and Murray came from 3 completely different eras of Spurs basketball. One was a defensive rebounder in the early 90s. One was a championship role player in the 2000s. One was a young all-star guard in the 2010s. Yet all 3 describe the exact same feeling. A culture that tested loyalty constantly and quietly removed anyone who failed that test for too long, no matter how much talent they brought to the floor. 3 decades apart, telling the same story in their own words. All of these stories build toward one player, one moment, that exposed the biggest weakness hiding inside Popovich's entire system. Kawhi Leonard was supposed to be the perfect successor to Tim Duncan. He grew inside the Spurs way from a quiet, overlooked prospect into a finals MVP and a true franchise superstar. For years, he represented everything Popovich's system was designed to create. Then, a quad injury changed everything almost overnight. Leonard's camp, including his uncle Dennis Robertson and his agent, sought an independent medical opinion from outside the team's own doctors. To an organization built entirely around control, that single decision looked like a betrayal. According to Robertson, the relationship cracked even further because Spurs doctors reportedly pushed Leonard to play through pain that he did not believe his own body could safely handle. What happened next turned painfully public for everyone to see. Tony Parker compared his own old leg injury to Leonard's, saying his was 1,000 times worse, almost as if questioning whether Leonard's pain was even real in the first place. Manu Ginobili added his own public doubts on top of it. Popovich himself criticized Leonard's leadership directly, telling reporters that players like Patty Mills and Ginobili were the team's real leaders, while leadership, in Popovich's own words, simply was not Leonard's deal. Try to imagine hearing your own coach say that about you out loud to reporters, while you're hurt and genuinely scared about your own body's future. Leonard pulled away from the organization completely. He stopped sitting with the team on the bench during the playoffs. He demanded a trade out of San Antonio. He eventually left for Toronto, where he won another championship almost immediately, this time standing on a different sideline, far away from Popovich. For more than 20 years, Popovich's system had worked because his biggest stars trusted him completely with their bodies and their careers. Kawhi Leonard was the first true superstar who refused to hand that control over without asking real questions. And the entire relationship simply collapsed under the weight of that refusal. Think about everything Kawhi Leonard represented before that injury. He was quiet. He worked hard. He almost never complained. He was the exact kind of player the Spurs way was designed to produce. A young man who let his game speak for him instead of his words. The system could not hold on to a player like that. A player who fit the mold almost perfectly for years. Then maybe the problem was never really about the players at all. Maybe the problem was a system that only worked as long as a player never asked it to bend. Not even once. Not even when his own body was on the line. It would be one thing if Popovich's need for control only damaged relationships off the court. But critics argue it also cost his team real games, at the worst possible moments, when a championship was sitting right there for the taking. These are not small, forgettable moments buried deep in a long regular season. These are finals games and conference finals, the exact moments coaches are remembered for, win or lose for the rest of their careers. Look at Game 6 of the 2013 NBA Finals against Miami. The Spurs were ahead late in the fourth quarter, just minutes away from another championship. Popovich made a choice that still gets debated by fans today. He benched Tim Duncan, his best rebounder and his best interior defender, in order to match Miami's smaller lineup on the floor. With Duncan off the court, the Spurs had nobody left to control the paint. Miami grabbed offensive rebound after offensive rebound on back-to-back possessions, and those second chances turned directly into game-saving three-pointers, including Ray Allen's now famous corner shot that sent the game into overtime. The Spurs lost that game in overtime. They lost Game 7 right after it. A championship that once looked completely locked up slipped away because of one stubborn coaching decision made in the final minutes. And it was not the only questionable choice in that same series. Popovich kept playing Manu Ginobili through a rough stretch, where he committed 8 turnovers in that single game, repeatedly breaking the team's offensive rhythm at the worst possible time. Across other seasons, Popovich also started a young shooter named Bryn Forbes for 2 full years, trying to develop him into a reliable perimeter threat. Even though Forbes posted the worst defensive rating of any rotation player on the entire roster, he gave heavy playoff minutes to veteran forward Matt Bonner as well, even as Bonner was repeatedly targeted on defense and struggled badly to grab rebounds in those same series. Years later, in the 2012 Western Conference Finals, the Spurs blew a 2-0 lead against Oklahoma City after Popovich failed to adjust his offense once the Thunder changed their defensive matchups against Tony Parker. In 2016, against that same Thunder roster, Popovich again refused to adjust his lineups against a much bigger front court of Serge Ibaka, Enes Kanter, and Steven Adams, and his team simply had no answer for it on the glass. A genius coach by almost every account can still become stubborn when his own system tells him he is right, even while the results on the court are loudly saying something very different. 4 different series, 4 different opponents, but the same root problem each time. A coach so confident in his own structure that he sometimes refused to bend it, even when the game in front of him was begging for a change. Popovich's need for control did not stop at the edges of his own roster. Critics argue it eventually changed the entire league around him. He became one of the very first coaches to regularly rest healthy star players during the regular season, a practice fans now simply call load management. The most famous example came on November 29, 2012, when Popovich sent Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, and Danny Green home early before a nationally televised game against Miami, without giving the league or the broadcasters proper warning ahead of time. NBA Commissioner David Stern fined the Spurs $250,000, calling it a disservice to fans who had tuned in expecting to watch real stars compete on national television. Popovich barely blinked at the punishment. He later listed Duncan on an official injury report simply as old, almost daring the league to challenge him again. Some have argued this approach protected players' long-term health across a brutal 82-game schedule. But former trainers, including longtime NBA trainer Gary Vitti, have pointed out that Popovich often scheduled these rest days before the season had even started, treating the entire calendar like a math problem, instead of a sport that real fans were paying money to watch live. Today, vague injury labels like general soreness show up constantly across the whole league, and many people trace that habit directly back to Popovich's early decisions in San Antonio. He may have protected his own team in the long run, but in doing so, he also helped make the regular season feel less reliable for the fans who show up every single night expecting to watch the best players actually compete. It is a strange kind of legacy to carry. A coach gets remembered for championships and banners, but he also gets remembered for changing how an entire league treats its own regular season. A parent buying tickets months in advance has no real guarantee their favorite player will even suit up that night. Some of that uncertainty traces back to a decision Popovich made on a single night in November, more than a decade ago, when he decided the rules of the schedule did not really apply to him. This same need for control shows up off the court too, in the way Popovich has handled criticism from the media and from outside voices. Former player and analyst Kendrick Perkins has openly criticized Popovich for how he treats reporters, pointing to a tense exchange with a journalist after Team USA's exhibition loss to Australia back in 2021. Perkins argued that Popovich's sharp, dismissive answers were less about protecting his team and more about deflecting blame away from his own coaching choices that night. He even pointed straight at Kawhi Leonard's departure as proof that not every great player actually needed Popovich in order to succeed at the highest level. Other media voices like Jason Whitlock went even further, accusing Popovich of creating what he called a victim mentality in young players like Wembanyama, and claiming the coach spent more time putting his own political views than focusing purely on basketball. Whether or not you agree with that particular criticism, it shows just how far the conversation around Popovich's control has spread, reaching well past the locker room and into the broader public conversation about who he really is. It is a pattern worth noticing. The same coach who demanded total compliance from teenagers in his own locker room also struggled to accept pointed questions from grown adults holding microphones. Control was never just a basketball philosophy for Popovich. It was something closer to a personality trait, one that followed him everywhere he went, whether he was facing a 19-year-old rookie or a veteran reporter just doing their job. So where does that leave the story we started with? Victor Wembanyama, Jeremy Sochan at point guard, ghost injuries on the report, and a Spurs team that looked lost almost on purpose. Maybe Popovich really was protecting a generational young talent for the long road ahead of him. Or maybe this was simply the same pattern, repeating itself one more time, with a new young star standing in the exact spot where Tony Parker, Beno Udrih, and Kawhi Leonard once stood before him. A coach who needed total control of the system, even if that meant sacrificing a winning record, or sacrificing trust, or sacrificing a player's own voice somewhere along the way. Maybe the truest answer is that it does not have to be only one or the other. A coach can genuinely care about a young player's future and still fall back on the same controlling habits that defined his entire career and shaped every roster he ever built. Those two things are not opposites. They have lived together inside Gregg Popovich for almost 30 years. And there is no clear reason to think that changed simply because the player in front of him now wears a different jersey number than the ones who came before him. None of this erases what Popovich actually built across his long career. He is still one of the greatest coaches the sport has ever seen. 5 championships across 2 different decades is not luck. It takes real genius to build a culture that disciplined, that consistent for that long, while almost everyone else in the league struggled to keep up. Tim Duncan, David Robinson, Tony Parker, and Manu Ginobili all became legends partly because of the structure Popovich gave them to grow inside of. That part of the story is real, and it absolutely deserves real respect from anyone who loves the game. Think about how rare that kind of consistency really is. Coaches come and go. Systems rise for a season or two, and then quietly fall apart once other teams figure them out. Popovich's system lasted across multiple generations of players, multiple eras of the league, and multiple completely different rosters. That alone places him in a category that very few coaches in any sport will ever reach. Anyone trying to tell this story honestly has to start there, with real respect for what he accomplished on the scoreboard. But greatness and cost are not opposites. They can live inside the very same story side by side for decades at a time. Popovich built a machine that won again and again for almost 30 straight years. Machines do not feel anything. They do not care how a player feels after a hard practice, or a public benching, or a sudden trade announcement that changes a man's whole life overnight. For every player who walked into that machine and came out stronger, like Tony Parker or Tim Duncan, another player walked into that same exact machine and came out broken, traded, silenced, or simply pushed out the door for good. Beno Udrih never recovered his confidence. Dennis Rodman never got the trust he believed he was promised in that contract. Stephen Jackson never got to play in those playoffs he had helped the team reach. Kawhi Leonard never came back to San Antonio at all. Add them all together, and a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Almost every era of Popovich's career produced at least one player willing to say on the record that the system cost them something real: a rookie's confidence, a veteran's natural game, a roster spot, a championship chance. A relationship that never healed. That is not one unlucky season. That is not one misunderstanding between a coach and a player who simply did not get along. That is a pattern stretching across 3 full decades, touching nearly every type of player the sport has ever produced, from undersized guards to 7-footers, from quiet rookies to outspoken veterans. That is the real legacy of Gregg Popovich. Not a simple story of a hero or a villain, but something harder to sit with for very long. A brilliant coach, a champion many times over, whose endless need for control built something close to perfect on the scoreboard, while quietly leaving behind a long trail of players who paid the price for it one season, and one career at a time. The banners in San Antonio are real. So are the players who say the cost of those banners landed squarely on their own shoulders. Both things are true at once, and that is exactly why this story refuses to end as simply as it began. Tony Parker, Beno Udrih, LaMarcus Aldridge, Richard Jefferson, Robert Horry, Dennis Rodman, Stephen Jackson, DeJounte Murray, Kawhi Leonard, and now, maybe, Victor Wembanyama. Different decades, different positions, different personalities. The same coach standing on the sideline through almost every single one of their stories, building championships with one hand while the other hand quietly decided who could stay and who had to go.